June 1944, Normandy. A German Panzer crew that had survived the Eastern Front watched in horror as an American infantry weapon they'd never seen before punched clean through 5 inches of their frontal armor from 300 yards away, something their intelligence had sworn was impossible. The crew survived, were captured, and what they discovered in American POW camps about this secret weapon shattered everything they'd been told about who was actually winning the war. But here's what haunts veterans like Hans Müller even 30 years later. How many thousands of German tanks were destroyed by a weapon their high command never even knew existed? And what does that say about everything else the Nazi regime lied about? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. June 1944, the hedgerows of Normandy, France. The air smelt like diesel fuel, wet earth, and something else. Something burnt that Hans Müller tried not to think about too much. Hans sat in the commander's cupola of his Panzer IV medium tank, watching the narrow French road ahead through his periscope. He was 26 years old. His face was lean and tanned from 3 years of war. His uniform was faded gray, stained with oil and dirt. On his collar were the small silver tabs that marked him as an Oberfeldwebel, a senior sergeant. He had earned those tabs on the Eastern Front, fighting the Russians. The tank rumbled forward at 15 kilometers per hour. Inside the steel hull, the engine roared so loud that Hans could feel it in his chest. The smell of gasoline and hot metal filled the cramped space. 4 other men shared this moving iron box with him. Klaus Weber, the gunner, sat to his left. Ernst Schmidt, the driver, was down in the front hull. Behind them were the loader and the radio operator, both young men who barely needed to shave. This Panzer IV weighed 25 tons. Its frontal armor was 80 millimeters thick. That was 3 inches of solid steel plate. Hans had seen Russian anti-tank rifles bounce off that armor like pebbles off a castle wall. He had seen Russian infantry throw grenades that did nothing but scratch the paint. The tank had carried him safely through 2 winters in Russia. Through mud and snow and fire. It had never let him down. The hedgerows rose on both sides of the road like green walls. These were not normal hedges. They were ancient earthen banks, 6 feet tall, covered with thick bushes and small trees. The roots went down deep into mounds of dirt and stone that had been there for hundreds of years. The Norman farmers had built them centuries ago to mark their fields. Now they made perfect hiding places. Hans did not like these hedgerows. In Russia, you could see for kilometers across the flat plains. You could spot enemy tanks from far away. You could maneuver. You could use your speed and your gun range. Here in Normandy, you could only see 30 meters ahead before the road turned. Every bend could hide an American tank. Every gap in the hedge could hide an American soldier with a weapon. But Hans was not worried about American infantry weapons. He had read the intelligence reports. He had attended the briefings. The German officers had been very clear. American infantry had rifles and machine guns and hand grenades. They had some anti-tank rifles that were old and weak. They had a weapon called the Bazooka, but the reports said it was unreliable. It often failed to fire. Its rockets were inaccurate. It could only penetrate armor at very close range, maybe 50 meters. And even then, only if it hit at exactly the right angle. The Americans were not like the Russians. The Russians were tough. The Russians had fought with desperate courage. The Russians had good tanks, especially the T-34. Hans had seen T-34s destroy entire German columns. He had seen his friends burn alive in their tanks when Russian shells punched through the armor. But Hans had survived Russia. If he could survive Russia, he could survive France. Klaus spoke through the intercom, his voice crackling in Hans's headset. "Commander, I see movement ahead. 200 meters. Infantry in the hedge on the right side." Hans pressed his face against the rubber padding of his periscope. He scanned the hedgerow. There, a flicker of olive drab fabric. American uniforms. Maybe 4 or 5 men. "I see them," Hans said. "Driver, slow down. Gunner, traverse right. Load high explosive." The turret whined as it rotated. Inside the tank, the loader pulled a heavy shell from the rack and shoved it into the breech of the 75mm gun. The breech clanged shut. "Loaded," the loader called out. Hans watched the Americans through his periscope. They were not running. They were not hiding. They were doing something. 2 men were kneeling in the gap in the hedgerow. One man was holding something on his shoulder. A tube. A long tube, about as thick as a man's arm. Hans had seen bazookas before, once in Italy. An American soldier had fired one at his tank from about 40 meters away. The rocket had hit the side skirt, the thin armor that hung over the tracks. It had made a small dent and then bounced off into the ditch. The Americans had run away, and Hans had killed them with machine gun fire. These Americans were much farther away. Hans estimated the distance. At least 250 meters, maybe closer to 300. That was the length of 3 football fields. No infantry weapon could hurt a tank from that distance. It was impossible. "Commander, should I fire?" Klaus asked. "Wait," Hans said. "Save the ammunition. Use the machine gun after they waste their rocket. Then we will run them over." Hans almost smiled. These Americans were fools. They did not understand tanks. They did not understand armor. They were about to learn. The American with the tube raised it higher on his shoulder. Another American crouched beside him, doing something with the back of the tube, loading it, probably. Hans heard a sound, a strange sound, not the crack of a rifle or the chatter of a machine gun, a whoosh, like air escaping from a tire, but much louder, much faster. Then he saw it, a streak of light, a tail of fire and smoke coming straight toward the tank. It happened so fast that Hans did not have time to think, did not have time to give an order, did not have time to do anything but watch. The rocket hit the front of the tank. The explosion was enormous. The entire tank shook like a bell being struck with a hammer. The sound was so loud that Hans felt it more than heard it, a deep boom that went through his bones. Then came the flash. Bright orange light filled the inside of the tank. Hans felt a blast of heat on his face. He smelled something burning. Not diesel, not rubber, something else, something terrible. The radio operator started screaming. Hans could not see. His eyes were full of white spots from the flash. He blinked hard, trying to clear his vision. His ears were ringing. He could not hear what anyone was saying. Smoke was pouring into the tank, thick black smoke that made him cough. He could hear crackling sounds. Fire. There was fire inside the tank. "Out!" Hans shouted. "Everybody out!" He threw open his hatch and pulled himself up through the cupola. His hands were shaking. He fell off the side of the tank and hit the ground hard. The impact knocked the wind out of his lungs. Klaus came tumbling out of the turret hatch, coughing and choking. Ernst crawled out of the driver's hatch, his face black with soot. The loader came next, moving fast. The radio operator did not come out. Hans lay in the grass beside the road, gasping for air. His whole body was trembling. He looked back at his tank. Smoke was pouring from the open hatches. He could see flames inside the crew compartment. He could hear ammunition starting to cook off, small pops and bangs as shells exploded from the heat. The front of the tank had a hole in it, a round hole, perfectly circular, about as wide as a man's fist. The edges of the hole glowed red hot. The Americans had punched through the frontal armor, through 80 millimeters of steel, from 300 meters away, with an infantry weapon. Hans stared at that hole and felt something cold spread through his chest, something worse than fear. It was confusing. It was disbelief. The intelligence reports had been wrong. Everything they had been told had been wrong. Klaus was lying in the grass next to him, also staring at the tank. His face was pale. His eyes were very wide. "What was that weapon?" Klaus whispered. "That is impossible. Infantry weapons cannot do that. Not at that range. It is impossible." Hans did not answer. He could not answer. He was watching the flames grow larger inside his tank. He was thinking about the radio operator, who had been 19 years old. He was thinking about the hole in the armor. He was thinking about how the rocket had come so fast that there had been no time to react, no time to turn, no time to reverse, no time to do anything. American soldiers were running toward them now, their rifles raised. Hans could hear them shouting in English. He raised his hands slowly. Klaus did the same. Ernst was already on his knees with his hands behind his head. Hans Müller had survived 3 years of war. He had survived Stalingrad. He had survived Kursk. He had survived battles that killed thousands of men. But today, on a quiet road in Normandy, an American soldier with a tube on his shoulder had destroyed his tank from farther away than Hans had thought possible. And as the Americans surrounded him, as they searched him for weapons and took his pistol and his binoculars, Hans kept thinking about that hole in the armor. What else had they been wrong about? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The American medic wrapped a bandage around Hans's burned hand. The medic was young, maybe 20 years old, with freckles across his nose. He worked carefully, gently, even though Hans was the enemy. He gave Hans 2 white pills and a canteen of water. The water was cold and clean. Hans had not tasted water that clean in months. They put Hans and Klaus and Ernst in the back of a truck. The truck was brand new. Hans could smell the fresh paint. The engine ran smoothly, without any knocking or smoking. In Germany, most of the trucks were old and breaking down. They had to use wood gas instead of gasoline because there was no fuel. But this American truck had plenty of gasoline. It drove fast down roads that were full of other American trucks, hundreds of them, maybe thousands. Hans watched through the canvas opening in the back. He saw American supply convoys stretching as far as he could see. Trucks carrying ammunition, trucks carrying food, trucks carrying fuel, trucks carrying spare parts. Everything was new, everything was organized. There were so many trucks that they had to wait in line just to move forward. Klaus was watching too. He leaned close to Hans and spoke quietly in German. "How many trucks do they have?" Hans shook his head. He did not know. More than he had ever seen in one place. More than the entire German army had on the Eastern Front. They drove for 3 days. They stopped at collection points where hundreds of German prisoners were gathered. The Americans gave them food twice a day. Canned meat, crackers, chocolate bars, coffee, real coffee, not the fake coffee made from acorns that Hans had been drinking for 2 years. The portions were larger than what German soldiers were getting. Hans knew this because he had received letters from home. His wife wrote that the rations kept getting smaller, that the children were always hungry. But here, as a prisoner, Hans was eating better than he had eaten since before the war. They put the prisoners on a ship. Hans had never been on a ship before. He felt sick from the motion of the waves, but the Americans gave them medicine for the sickness. They gave them clean bunks to sleep in. They gave them 3 meals every day. The ship took them to America, to a place called Maryland. Hans had never heard of Maryland. He did not know where it was on the map. The prisoner of war camp was near a town called Aberdeen. The camp had rows of wooden barracks surrounded by wire fences. Guard towers stood at each corner. But the barracks were clean and dry. Each man had his own bunk with a real mattress. There were showers with hot water. There was a kitchen that served hot food 3 times a day. On the first morning, they served eggs for breakfast. Real eggs, 2 eggs per man, with toast and butter and jam. Hans sat at the long table and stared at his plate. He could not remember the last time he had seen 2 eggs on one plate. Ernst was sitting across from him. Ernst was crying. Tears ran down his face while he ate his eggs. "My mother has not seen an egg in 6 months," Ernst whispered. "She wrote to me. She said the chickens stopped laying because there is no feed. But here they give us 2 eggs to prisoners." Hans could not eat his second egg. He wrapped it in a napkin and put it in his pocket. He did not know why. There was nowhere to send it, but he could not eat it. After breakfast, a guard took them to a training field. This was not a training field for prisoners. This was a training field for American soldiers. But the Americans were letting the prisoners watch. On the field, American soldiers were practicing with weapons. Hans saw the tube weapon, the one that had destroyed his tank. There were dozens of them, maybe 50 or 60, all laid out in neat rows on the grass. An American officer was teaching young soldiers how to use the weapon. He spoke through a translator, a German-speaking American who explained everything to the prisoners. "This is the M9A1 Bazooka," the officer said. "It fires a rocket that weighs 3.5 pounds. The rocket can penetrate 5 inches of armor at 300 yards. We have produced over 400,000 of these weapons. Every infantry company has at least 6 of them." Hans felt dizzy. 5 inches of armor. That was thicker than his Panzer IV. That was as thick as a Tiger tank in some places. And they had made 400,000 of them. Klaus grabbed Hans's arm. His fingers dug in hard. 400,000, Klaus said. That is more than all the tanks Germany has built in the entire war. The American officer kept talking. He explained how the weapon worked, how it was simple to use, how any soldier could learn to fire it in 1 day, how the rockets were cheap to make, how they could make thousands of rockets every single day in their factories. Hans thought about the intelligence reports, the ones that said the bazooka was unreliable, that it only worked at close range, that it was not a serious threat. Every single word had been a lie. They assigned the prisoners to work details. Hans was sent to a factory near the camp. The factory made military equipment, radios and engine parts, and metal boxes for ammunition. On his first day at the factory, Hans saw the workers eating lunch. They sat at tables in a big room with windows. They ate sandwiches made with white bread, thick slices of meat and cheese. They drank coffee from metal thermoses. They smoked cigarettes, American cigarettes, not the harsh tobacco that German soldiers smoked. The workers were laughing and talking. Some of them were women, young women with clean dresses and lipstick. They worked on the assembly lines just like the men. They looked healthy and strong. Their faces were not thin. Their eyes were not hollow. Hans had not seen anyone look that healthy in Germany for 3 years. A supervisor gave Hans a sandwich. I just gave it to him. Turkey and cheese on soft white bread with mayonnaise. Hans held the sandwich in his hands and could not stop looking at it. This was a better sandwich than the German officers were eating. This was better food than Hans had served at his own wedding dinner before the war. And they gave it to a prisoner, to the enemy, just because it was lunchtime. Klaus was working at the same factory. During the afternoon break, a truck arrived. The truck had a picture painted on the side, a red circle with white writing, Coca-Cola. The workers lined up and the truck driver handed out bottles of Coca-Cola from an ice chest. The bottles were covered in frost. Condensation dripped down the glass. The supervisor gave bottles to the prisoners too. Hans held the cold bottle in his hand. He had heard of Coca-Cola before the war. It was an American drink, a luxury, something only rich people in big cities could buy. But here, factory workers got it for free, in the middle of the afternoon, just because it was a hot day. Hans opened the bottle and took a drink. The liquid was sweet and cold and fizzy. It tasted like nothing he had ever had before. He watched Klaus drinking his Coca-Cola. Klaus was standing very still, staring at nothing. Then Klaus started to cry. Not loud crying, just tears running down his face while he drank his Coca-Cola. An ice cream truck came the next day. The workers bought ice cream bars for 10 cents each. The supervisor bought ice cream for all the prisoners too. Hans held the cold bar wrapped in paper. It was already starting to melt in the summer heat. He bit into it. Vanilla ice cream with chocolate coating, sweet and cold and smooth. Hans had not eaten ice cream since 1941. Before the war, ice cream was a special treat, something you bought on Sundays in the summer, something children got excited about. But here, factory workers ate ice cream on a Tuesday afternoon. Hans stood there with melting ice cream dripping down his fingers. He watched American workers eating and laughing. He thought about his last letter from home. His wife had written that their daughters were eating turnip soup for dinner. The same soup every night for 3 weeks, because there was nothing else. And here, in America, they gave ice cream to prisoners. Hans looked at Klaus. Klaus was looking back at him. Neither of them said anything, but Hans could see the same thought in Klaus's eyes. We were told America was weak. We were told democracy made nations soft. We were told they couldn't fight. We were told they couldn't build things. We were told they were not a real threat. But they give ice cream to factory workers. They make 400,000 bazookas. They have more trucks than we have soldiers. What else were we told that was a lie? November 1944, Thanksgiving Day. Hans had learned this was an American holiday, a day when families gather to eat a big meal and give thanks for what they had. The prisoners did not expect anything special. They were already eating better than most people in Germany. But the Americans surprised them. The mess hall was decorated with colored paper, orange and yellow and brown. The guards had hung pictures of turkeys on the walls. Long tables were set with real plates and metal forks and knives, not the tin plates they usually used. When the food came, Hans could not believe what he was seeing. Each prisoner received a full plate of turkey, real turkey, roasted until the skin was brown and crispy. Next to the turkey was a pile of mashed potatoes with butter melting into it. There was green beans. There was stuffing made with bread and herbs. There was a red sauce they called cranberry. There was a slice of pumpkin pie with whipped cream on top. Hans sat down and stared at his plate. This was more food than a German family would see in a month. This was a feast, a celebration meal, the kind of meal you served at Christmas or Easter or a wedding. And they were serving it to prisoners, to enemy soldiers, to men who had been trying to kill Americans just 6 months ago. Ernst sat down next to Hans. His hands were shaking as he picked up his fork. "This is not right," Ernst whispered. "This cannot be right."
Hans knew what he meant.
It was not right that they were eating like this while their families were starving. It was not right that the enemy treated them better than their own country had. Klaus joined them, carrying his full plate. He set it down carefully, as if the food might disappear if he moved too fast. "I got a letter yesterday," Klaus said quietly, "from my sister. She said they are eating potato peels. Just the peels. They boil them to make soup. The potatoes themselves they have to save for the children." Hans had received a letter too, 3 days ago, from his wife Anna. He had read it so many times that he had memorized every word. She wrote that their daughters, Maria and Sophie, were hungry all the time, that she gave them her own food portions because she could not stand to hear them cry, that Maria, who was 8 years old, had stopped growing, that Sophie, who was 6, had gotten sick because she was not eating enough. Anna had tried to make the letter cheerful. She wrote about how the girls were doing well in school, how they helped with chores, how they asked about their father every day. But Hans could read between the words. He could hear the desperation, the fear, the hunger. And now he sat in front of more food than his entire family would eat in a week. He picked up his fork. He cut a piece of turkey. He put it in his mouth and chewed slowly. It tasted wonderful, juicy and tender and perfectly seasoned. But he could barely swallow it. His throat felt tight. Around him, other prisoners were eating in silence. Some were crying while they ate. Some had stopped eating and just sat there, staring at their plates. One man got up and ran outside. Hans could hear him being sick in the grass. After dinner, Hans went back to his barracks. He lay on his bunk and stared at the ceiling. The other men were quiet too. Nobody wanted to talk about the meal. Nobody wanted to say out loud what they were all thinking. Klaus climbed onto the bunk below Hans. "I cannot stop thinking about it," Klaus said into the darkness. "The bazooka. They did not just build one secret weapon, they built thousands, hundreds of thousands. While we were being told that Germany was winning the war, while we were being told that America was weak and soft and could not fight." Hans closed his eyes. He had been thinking the same thing for months, ever since that day in Normandy, ever since the rocket had punched through his tank's armor from 300 meters away. "The bazooka was not even their best weapon," Klaus continued. "It was just what they gave to regular infantry, to ordinary soldiers. Something cheap enough to make hundreds of thousands of them. Something simple enough that any man could learn to use it in one day. And it could destroy our best tanks." Hans thought about the American factories he had seen, the assembly lines that ran day and night, the workers who ate sandwiches and drank Coca-Cola and went home to their families every evening, the women who worked alongside the men, building engines and radios and weapons, the trucks that arrived every day with new supplies, new materials, new everything. Germany had nothing like that. Germany's factories were being bombed. Germany's workers were starving. Germany's women were trying to keep their children alive on turnip soup and potato peels. "We lost the war before it even started," Hans said quietly. "We just did not know it." Klaus was silent for a long time. Then he said, "They told us that Jews and democracy made nations weak, that only a strong leader and a pure race could build a powerful country. But America has all those things they said were weaknesses, and America buried us." Hans had been raised to believe certain things. He had been taught in school that Germans were superior, that other races were inferior, that democracy was chaos, that only Hitler's way could make Germany strong. He had believed these things. He had fought for these things. He had risked his life for these things. But now he lay in a clean bunk with a full stomach in a country that he had been told was weak and decadent and doomed. And his wife and children were starving in the country that he had been told strong and pure and destined to rule the world. The propaganda had been completely backward. Everything had been a lie. Hans reached under his pillow and pulled out Anna's letter. He read it again by the dim light from the window. She wrote about Maria asking when the war would be over, when Papa would come home, when they would have enough food again. Hans folded the letter carefully and put it back under his pillow. He thought about the Thanksgiving dinner, the turkey and potatoes and pie. He thought about the ice cream truck at the factory, Coca-Cola, the white bread sandwiches, the eggs for breakfast, the hot showers, clean clothes. And he thought about the bazooka, that simple tube that any soldier could carry, that cheap rocket that could be made by the thousands, that weapon his commanders had said was no threat, that weapon that had destroyed his tank and killed his radio operator, and changed everything Hans thought he knew about the war. A guard walked past the barracks. He was a black American soldier. Hans had learned that America had soldiers of many different races, Jews and Italians and Irish and Polish and black men, all fighting together, all working together, all building weapons together. In Germany, they would have been sent to camps or killed. Germany said these people were weak, inferior, useless. But these were the people who had built 400,000 bazookas. These were the people who had buried the German army in steel and fire. Hans closed his eyes and felt something break inside his chest. Not his body, something deeper, something in his mind, in his beliefs, in everything he had thought was true. They had told him that Germany was the master race, but Germany could not even feed its children. They had told him that America was weak, but America fed its prisoners better than Germany fed its soldiers. They had told him that the Führer was making Germany great, but the Führer had led them into a war against a nation that could make weapons faster than Germany could count them. Everything had been a lie, every single thing, and Hans had believed it all. He had fought for it. He was killed for it. And for what? So his daughters could eat potato peels while he ate turkey in an American prison camp? Klaus spoke one more time from the bunk below. His voice was barely a whisper. What do we tell them when we go home? How do we explain what we saw here? Hans did not answer. He did not know. How could you explain to people who are starving that their enemy ate ice cream? How could you tell people who had lost everything that they had been lied to from the beginning? How could you make them understand that the war was not lost on the battlefield, but in the factories, in the fields, in the fundamental difference between a nation that valued all its people and a nation that threw its people away? Hans lay awake for a long time that night. Outside, he could hear American music playing on a radio somewhere. Inside, he could hear other prisoners breathing in the darkness. Some were crying softly, some were praying. Some were just lying still, lost in their own thoughts. And Hans thought about that hole in his tank's armor, that perfect circular hole that should not have existed, that hole that had shown him the truth about everything. Spring 1946. The ship that carried Hans home was nothing like the ship that had brought him to America. This ship was old and crowded and smelled like unwashed bodies and sickness. Thousands of German prisoners packed into spaces meant for hundreds. They slept on the floor. They waited in long lines for food. The voyage took 3 weeks. But Hans did not complain. He was going home. He carried very little with him. A small bag with some clothes, a bar of American chocolate that he had saved, a technical manual about the bazooka that he had found in the camp library and hidden in his belongings. And in his pocket, every letter Anna had sent him. 43 letters. He counted them many times. The ship landed at Bremerhaven in northern Germany. Hans stepped off onto German soil for the first time in 2 years. The dock was damaged from bombing. Cranes stood broken and twisted. Buildings collapsed into piles of bricks. Everywhere he looked, he saw destruction. The American authorities gave each prisoner a card with travel papers and a small amount of German marks. Then they were free to go. Just like that. After 2 years as prisoners, they could walk away. Hans and Klaus and Ernst stood together on the dock. They had survived the war together. They had survived the destruction of their tank together. They had survived captivity together. Now they were about to go their separate ways. Ernst was going to Berlin. Klaus was going to Munich. Hans was going to Hamburg. They shook hands. They did not say much. What was there to say? They had seen things that nobody would believe. They had learned things that nobody wanted to hear. Klaus gripped Hans's hand hard. "Tell them the truth," Klaus said. "Tell them what we saw. Maybe if enough of us tell the truth, things can be different." Hans nodded, but he did not know if he believed it. He did not know if anyone would listen. The train to Hamburg took 2 days. It should have taken 6 hours, but the tracks were damaged. The train had to stop and wait. Sometimes it had to go backward and find another route around destroyed bridges. The train was packed with people. Soldiers coming home, refugees looking for lost families. Everyone is thin and tired and quiet. Hans looked out the window at Germany. His Germany. The country he had fought for. The country he had believed in. It was destroyed. Completely destroyed. Every city the train passed through was a ruin. Buildings with no roofs. Walls with no windows. Churches with no steeples. Factories with no machines. Bridges that ended in the middle of rivers. Roads that disappeared into craters. And people. So many people. Thin people with hollow eyes and dirty clothes. Old women pulling carts full of firewood. Children begging at the train stations. Men with missing arms and missing legs, sitting on street corners with metal cups for coins. This was what victory was supposed to look like. This was what the Führer had promised. This was what the master race had built. Hans felt sick. The train arrived in Hamburg late at night. Hans got off and stood on the platform. The station roof was gone. He could see the stars above him. The waiting room was destroyed. The ticket office was a pile of rubble. He walked through the streets toward his home. He had lived in Hamburg his whole life. He knew every street, every building, every corner. But now he did not recognize anything. The street signs were gone. The buildings collapsed. Some streets were completely blocked with rubble. He had to climb over piles of bricks and broken concrete. He had to ask for directions 3 times. It took him 2 hours to walk what should have taken 20 minutes. Finally, he found his street, or what was left of it. Half the buildings were destroyed. The other half were damaged, with windows covered in boards and walls cracked and leaning. His building was still standing, barely. The front wall was black from the fire. The windows on the top floor were blown out, but it was there. He climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor. His legs were shaking, his hands were shaking. He had dreamed of this moment for 2 years, coming home, seeing his family, holding his daughters. He knocked on the door. Nothing happened for a long moment. Then he heard footsteps, slow footsteps. The door opened a crack. A chain kept it from opening all the way. A woman's face looked out. It took Hans a moment to recognize her. It was Anna, his wife, but she looked 20 years older. Her face was thin and lined. Her hair was gray. Her eyes were sunken. She was wearing a dress that hung loose on her body because she had lost so much weight. She stared at her. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. "Anna," Hans said, "it's me. I'm home." She made a sound, not quite a scream, not quite a sob, something in between. Her hands fumbled with the chain. She threw open the door and fell into his arms. She weighed nothing. Hans could feel her ribs through her dress. She was shaking and crying and holding him so tight that it hurt. "You're alive," she kept saying. "You're alive! You're alive!" Two girls appeared in the doorway, Maria and Sophie, his daughters. They stared at him with wide eyes. They looked scared. They did not recognize him. Maria had been 6 years old when Hans left for the war. Now she is 10. She was so thin that her arms looked like sticks. Her dress was too small and patched in several places. Her shoes had holes in them. Sophie had been 4 years old. Now she is 8. She was even thinner than Maria. Her face was pale. Her eyes were too big for her face. Hans knelt down. "Maria, Sophie, it's Papa. I came home." Maria started to cry. Sophie hid behind her sister. Anna pulled the girls forward. "It's your father," she said. "He's home now. Everything will be better now." But Hans looked around the apartment and knew that was not true. Nothing was better. The windows were broken and covered with boards. The furniture was gone, sold or burned for firewood, probably. The walls were stained with water damage. The rooms were cold and empty. They sat together in the kitchen. Anna made tea, real tea, somehow. She must have been saving it. There was no sugar, no milk, but it was warm and it was something. Anna told him everything, about the bombings, about the firestorm that had swept through Hamburg in 1943 and killed 40,000 people in one night, about how they had survived in the basement while the city burned above them, about hunger, the constant hunger, about how she had given her food to the girls, about how she had traded her wedding ring for a bag of potatoes, about how they had eaten grass and dandelion leaves and tree bark, about how Sophie had gotten sick last winter and almost died because there was no medicine and no doctors and no food to help her get strong again. Maria sat very close to Hans, watching Hans like he might disappear. Sophie had climbed into Anna's lap, still not quite believing he was real. Hans reached into his bag. He pulled out the chocolate bar. It was a little melted and bent, but it was still wrapped. "I brought this for you," he said. The girls stared at the chocolate like it was made of gold. Anna's hand went to her mouth. Hans broke the chocolate into pieces. He gave a piece to each girl. He gave a piece to Anna. He took a small piece for himself. Maria put the chocolate in her mouth and closed her eyes. Tears ran down her cheeks. Sophie ate hers so fast she almost choked. Anna just held hers, looking at it, crying silently. "Where did you get chocolate?" Anna whispered. "In America," Hans said, "in the prison camp." Anna looked at him, really looked at him. She reached out and touched his face, his arms. "You look healthy," she said. "You look fed." Hans nodded slowly. He did not know how to explain. He did not know where to start. Over the next weeks, he tried. He told Anna about the camp, about the food, about the factories, about the bazookas, about the trucks and the ships and the planes and the weapons, about the ice cream and the Coca-Cola and the Thanksgiving dinner. Anna listened. Sometimes she cried. Sometimes she just shook her head. Sometimes she got angry. "Why?" she asked one night. "Why did they feed you so well while we starved? You were the enemy." Hans had thought about that question many times. "Because they could," he said finally. "Because they had so much that feeding prisoners cost them nothing. Because their whole country was not destroyed. Because they fought the war with factories, not with cities. Because they valued life differently than we did. He showed her the technical manual, the one about the bazooka. He explained how it worked, how many they had made, how they had kept it secret until it was too late. We never had a chance, Hans said. From the very beginning. We were told we were winning. We were told America was weak. But they were building weapons we did not even know existed. They were making them by the hundreds of thousands, while we could barely make hundreds. Anna was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "What do we do now?" Hans did not know. Germany was broken, divided, occupied. Millions were dead. Millions more were homeless. The cities were rubble. The economy was destroyed. There was no government, no law, no future that anyone could see. But Hans knew one thing. He knew he would never believe propaganda again. He would never trust leaders who told him what he wanted to hear instead of what was true. He would never let his daughters be taught the lies that he had been taught. He found work as a machinist. The pay was terrible. The factory was damaged and had no heat. But it was work. It was something. He refused to join any political groups. When men came around talking about the old days, about how Germany had been betrayed, about how the Führer had been right, Hans walked away. When they tried to tell him that the Americans had been lucky, that Germany had almost won, that next time would be different, Hans told them about the bazooka. They made 400,000 of them, Hans would say. 400,000! And we did not know they existed until they were blowing holes in our tanks. That was not luck. That was not almost winning. That was complete, total defeat. And it happened because we believed lies. Most people did not want to hear it. They turned away. They called him a traitor. They said he had been brainwashed by the Americans. But some people listened. Young people mostly. People who were tired of the old lies. People who wanted to build something different. Years passed. The city was slowly rebuilt. Food became more available. The girls grew up. Maria became a teacher. Sophie became a nurse. Anna got stronger, though she never fully recovered from the hunger years. Hans never forgot. He kept the technical manual hidden in a box under his bed. Sometimes he would take it out and look at it. That simple weapon, that tube and rocket that any soldier could use, that tool that had shown him the truth. In 1975, 30 years after the war ended, a school asked Hans to speak to students about his experiences. He was an old man now, 63 years old. His hair was white, his hands shook a little, but his mind was clear. He stood in front of 40 young Germans who had been born after the war, who had grown up in a different Germany, a democratic Germany, a peaceful Germany. He told them about the bazooka, about the tank, about the hole in the armor that should not have existed, about the prison camp, about the food and the factories and the abundance, about coming home to a destroyed country and a starving family. The bazooka taught me something, Hans said to those students. It taught me that propaganda dies when it meets reality, that arrogance is a death sentence, that when you believe you are superior to everyone else, you stop learning, you stop improving, you stop seeing the truth, and the truth will destroy you. He paused. The students were very quiet, very attentive. We were told America was weak, Hans continued. We were told democracy made nations soft. We were told that Jews and different races made countries fail. But America had all those things, and America buried us. Not because they were lucky, not because we almost won, but because they had something we did not have. They had a system that used all their people, that valued all their people, that let all their people contribute. While we were throwing people away, they were building bazookas. Hans reached into his bag. He pulled out a photograph. It showed his Panzer IV smoking in a French field, June 1944. The hole in the frontal armor was clearly visible. "I survived the weapon that made this hole," Hans said. "But Germany never survived the lie that we were invincible. That lie killed millions. That lie destroyed our country. That lie left my daughters eating potato peels while I ate turkey in an American prison camp." He held up another photograph. This one showed Maria and Sophie as adults, smiling, healthy, standing with their own children. "The bazooka pierced 5 inches of armor," Hans said, "but the truth it represented pierced something thicker. It pierced our delusions, our pride, our willingness to believe comfortable lies instead of uncomfortable truths. And maybe that is what finally let us heal. Maybe that is what let us build this new Germany, this peaceful Germany, this honest Germany." He looked at the students, young faces, hopeful faces, faces that had never known war or hunger or propaganda. "Do not believe anyone who tells you that you are superior to others. Do not believe anyone who tells you that democracy is a weakness. Do not believe anyone who promises easy victories and glorious wars. Because I believed those things, and I watched my country burn, and I watched my family starve, and I learned, too late, that the simple truth is always stronger than the beautiful lie." The students were silent when he finished. Then one of them raised his hand. "What happened to the chocolate bar?" the student asked. "The one you brought home?" Hans smiled. It was a sad smile. "We ate it," he said, "all of us, together in our cold apartment in a destroyed city. And it was the best thing we had tasted in years, because it came from a place that still had chocolate to give away. And that taught me everything I needed to know about who really won the war." Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.